So, welcome to HEDG Hosts, a series of events run by the Historical Economics and Development Group at the University of Southern Denmark, where we invite some of the most incisive writers and thinkers inside and outside academia to present their work and demonstrate the relevance and continued impact of historical developments on contemporary societies. Today, we are excited to welcome Dr. Marvin Suesse from Trinity College, Dublin. Marvin is an economic historian who has published on a variety of topics, including the collapse of the Soviet Union. He is now Associate Director for Research at the Centre for Economics, Policy and History, an all-Irish think tank funded by the Irish Higher Education Authority. We're looking forward to hearing his talk today on the nationalist dilemma. Before we get started, one practical note as usual. You will not be able to ask questions live during the talk because we're on a Zoom webinar, but there will be time afterwards for questions. You have to write them into the Q&A, so use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then I will read them to Marvin for you. Over to you, Marvin.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for the kind introduction. So I've rarely been called incisive, so I think that's a great privilege. And let me just try and share the screen because I do have some slides prepared. I hope you can see them here. So can you see my slides, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So it's, of course, a bit of a tall order to present the whole book here within the 35 minutes or so. So let me just try and actually go to full screen. There we go. That's beautiful. So what I'll do today is I'll focus on one theme that is particular prominent in this book, right? The Nationalist Dilemma, which has come out with Cambridge University Press this year. And that is how this concept of economic nationalism can help us to understand the evolution of the modern world economy over the last few centuries or so, right? So this is going to be a relatively kind of broad picture overview. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by motivating why we need economic nationalism as a concept in our social scientists toolkit by briefly looking at four big trends that I think characterize the modern world economy today. So these are kind of four trends that you may have picked up when you read the financial press. And they're kind of four puzzles, I think, that are relatively hard to explain using our standard toolkits. Right? Then I'm going to talk just a little bit about the methodology underlying the book, and I'm going to keep this quite brief, but maybe not surprisingly, given what Paul has already said, this is largely a plea for looking at history in order to have a better sense of where we're going today. And the bulk of my talk will be looking at a variety of case studies that are drawn from the book to illuminate those four puzzles that I posed at the beginning and then hopefully solve them. Then I'll draw some implications from that for understanding our situation today. So let's start with my four puzzles. Right? So all of those four puzzles kind of revolve around what I think is kind of a central contradiction that always really strikes me when I follow the news. And that is that we live in an age where there are very high levels of integration, economic and technological integration on various dimensions. But on the other hand, we also see various isolationist or protectionist or nativist movements and reactions. Right? And those four puzzles are related to this big macro contradiction. So often when we think about isolationism, we associate this with Trump, with Brexit, etc. But I think it's important to go a bit beyond the confines of our North Atlantic world, and look, for example, at increasing Chinese investment in the global south, in particular in Africa, which has been growing quite rapidly over the last decade. So here, clearly, in some way, the world is getting closer together, but this has not actually reduced conflict, and quite opposed to that. So despite all the talks about BRICS and multipolar world orders, etc., Chinese investment in many African countries has triggered quite severe protectionist reactions, a lot of protests, etc. Right? And the question is, why is that? Why does FDI in some contexts trigger these kind of isolationist reactions? Because it is clearly not the case that FDI always and everywhere incites these reactions, right? I'm talking at the moment here from Dublin, from Ireland, a country that receives a lot of FDI, and it does not incite the same kind of protest as it does in many African countries. Now, another puzzle is, and that many national governments are oscillating between two poles. I think this is particularly visible when you look at the Chinese government under Xi Jinping, who, on the one hand, you see isolationist tendencies for sure. So, for example, Xi Jinping has tried to crack down both on domestic tech firms, which in a way were supposed to be, to some extent, national champions in the Chinese settings, also on the activities of foreign firms in the country, which are becoming ever more tightly regulated. But this has not meant that China has pivoted to some form of autarky, because at the same time, the Chinese government has been very clear that they want to attract more foreign direct investment, right? And this is the very same government that tries to, its very best to control multinational companies that are active in China, that also, as it says here, rolls out the welcome wagon for those companies. So again, those two contradictory trends. There is, on the one hand, yes, we want more integration. On the other hand, a trend towards isolation. And then we have something similar when we look, for example, at the state of the European Union. On the one hand, there is, of course, Brexit. There are kind of these fragmenting tendencies within the union. So you say, clear, that's national isolation. But then on the other hand, there's also a trend towards more regional integration, right? So, for example, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has advocated that Europe should have its own industrial policy and economic sovereignty. And so in a speech at the start of this year, he called for European strategic autonomy. So kind of using the language and the kind of nationalist industrial policy tools that we would usually associate with nation states, but transposing them to the level of the European Union. So again, it's not straightforward isolation, it's not straightforward globalization, but it is something in between. And I think the same if we step back for a moment and we look at those nativist or isolationist movements that have been making the headlines over the past decades, whether it's Trump in the US or Brexit in Britain, or any range of the other movements in the global south, be it Narendra Modi in India, be it Erdogan in Turkey, etc. This all occurs at a time when, through technological progress, technological change, which is enormous, the world is coming closer together in the sense that it is ever easier to communicate. And the fact that I am giving a webinar now to a crowd of people who may be dispersed around the globe is testament to that. Right? So, how do we understand this? On the one hand, again, force towards integration. On the other hand, increasing tendencies of isolation. And so what I argue in the book is that in order to understand these seemingly contradictory trends, we need to add, as social scientists, as economists, as economic historians, this new concept to our toolkit, which is economic nationalism. And that's something that I think a lot of economists have problems with, right? So let me kind of go through in a way the premises or stages of this argument. So I think the first premise on which this rests is pretty uncontroversial for everyone, and that is that, nationalism is the thing. Now, there are people who are nationalists, and they may even self-identify as nationalists in the sense that they view the nation as the supreme form of community. So I think even most economists would agree with that. I think what people find harder to swallow is the second part of the argument, and I devote a large part of the book to making this point, and saying that nationalism is not just a political ideology, it's not, or just a cultural ideology. It's not just about waving flags, but it has an economic content as well. It has an economic dimension in the sense that nationalists think about economics. They make certain economic assumptions based on certain premises about how the economy works, and they have certain aims that they want economic policy to accomplish. Right? And then the third part of the argument is that this nationalist thinking on the economy, right, follows certain recurring patterns, right? And that we can look at history in the way that I do in this book by looking at a vast array of historical case studies, and then try to generalize situations in which we see particular types of nationalist thinking on the economy emerging. Right? That are just briefly kind of three major factors that I would emphasize. So that kind of privilege the occurrence of certain strands of nationalist thinking. And I'll go into more detail on that later. But the first are structural conditions, material conditions. So these are typically the things that we can measure using our standard economic history toolkit, right? We can measure import penetration, we can measure the amount of FDI, we can measure number of migrants crossing a border, etc. But this is not the whole story. So I think one aspect that we often tend to neglect is that of narratives. So narratives are basically stories that are told about those economic realities, right? They're interpretations of those realities, and they often have a dynamic of their own, right? And they may be grounded in numbers, they may be grounded in some aspect of objective truth, but they may also diverge from that to considerable extents, right? And narratives can be very powerful, even if their relationship to objective conditions is rather tenuous. Right? So I think debates about migration are often a case in point here. There is only a fairly tenuous connection between the number of migrants crossing a border and the political reactions that this invokes. Right? The political reactions that are invoked by migrant flows will depend on a whole range of other factors, and often depend on how migrants are represented in the media, the story that think tanks may tell, etc. And those stories matter. And then the third factor are exogenous shocks. Right? In my book, there are often either wars or financial crises that suddenly lend credence to particular existing narratives that may have been around for a while, but then a shock comes along and kind of gives prominence to certain narratives, kind of often gives them almost a second lease of life. And then the really interesting thing is about thinking how those three sets of factors interact in shaping nationalist thinking on the economy, and also shaping the ability of nationalists to then enact policies based on those ideas. Right, so for the kind of the methodologically inclined, then basically what I do is I try to marry certain aspects of intellectual history, right, which kind of pays close attention to how important ideas are, the internal structure of ideas, but also how ideas are marketed, how they're packaged, and how they are disseminated, with traditional economic history, which is saying, okay, what is the economic or political context in which particular ideas might arise, and how can those ideas then in turn impact real economic events, largely through their impact on policy. And so there's a kind of, in a way, a circular model here that certain economic conditions tend to give rise to certain sets of ideas. Those ideas may filter through to policy, and therefore that have an impact on material outcomes. And this is, in terms of philosophy, is a little bit similar to what international relations scholars call constructivism, right? So it's an approach that believes that material interests matter. We do have interest that can be analyzed objectively, but our understanding of what those interests are and our preferences as well may be shaped by ideas, by identity, etc. So having said that, let's go and look at the first puzzle, right? So resistance to foreign direct investment in history. So I'm trying to tease out what might be some of the conditions that give rise to resistance to foreign direct investment. And I think one good place to start is the late Russian Empire, which in the 1890s, largely under the Minister of Finance, Sergei Witte, saw a large influx of foreign direct investment from a variety of countries, from Britain, from Germany, increasingly from France as well. And Witte himself was a bit of a technocrat, and he really believed that FDI was very important in terms of propelling the Russian economy forwards. But these policies were highly unpopular with many Russians outside of those fairly narrow technocratic circles. They were, for obvious reasons, quite unpopular with the land-owning aristocracy, who generally were not that keen on the industry, but they were also quite unpopular with many Russian workers. So there were various kind of protest movements, sometimes riots that turned quite violent, where workers would assassinate foreign managers, foreign-owned factories would go up in flames, etc. And what you see if you look at the qualitative literature on this topic is that one group that is particularly targeted are not actually foreigners in the sense that they have just come from Germany or France, but they are local Jewish or German entrepreneurs, right, who are who at that point were a very prominent, commercially active minority in the western parts of the empire, who had of course been living there for a number of centuries, and who had become increasingly commercially successful during the 19th century, much to the disappointment of Russian merchants as well as many Russian workers. And those German and Jewish entrepreneurs, they are targeted because they are seen largely as kind of entry points, as gateways for foreign investment, right? So they're seen in a way as kind of collaborators with foreigners who come in and build factories. And this then kind of leads to these very hateful and to some degree quite destructive reactions. And you can see quite a similar scenarios unfolding, in a different case, which is not on the slides here, but what it is in the book, and that's the late Ottoman Empire, right, where the Young Turk movement targets Armenian or Greek entrepreneurs because they associate this entrepreneurial group with the increasing internationalization of the Ottoman economy in the late 19th century. So in a way, there is an interaction here of resistance to external investment, but also resistance to those locally who are seen as agents of this internationalization. And you see similar dynamics, but with a less explicit ethnic focus in a very classic case, which is Argentina. So as we well know as economic historians, Argentina is a very classic Haksha-Olin country, right? Integration in the 19th century globalized economy, exporting agricultural products, and this largely benefits landowners rather than wage workers. Right? And in parallel to this kind of export focus of the Argentine economy, you have increasing FDI, largely the most prominent of that is British investment in railways. And this constellation leads to the rise of a very prominent streak of populism in Argentine politics in the interwar period. The most famous of those populists, of course, then becomes Juan Perón. And what Perón does is he links domestic inequality, so this divergence between largely landowners and the urban precariat in Buenos Aires, to the previous decades of export-led growth, to the inversion of foreign capital. And in particular, what he says is that the reason why we have an elite in this country, in Argentina, why some people have gotten very rich, is because they have disproportionately profited from exports and from basically collaborating with British FDI. And what Perón then tries to do in, kind of very, very well publicized and marketized speeches. So, he has a very well-oiled PR machine, is that he calls, a revived economy free from foreign capitalism. So here there's the isolationism parts, but also free from the Argentines who have been compromised by association with foreign capitalists. Mm-hmm. And in a different speech, he calls them la oligarquía vende patria, right? They are the oligarchs who have quite literally sold out their homeland by, exporting goods abroad, by collaborating with, British investors. And by doing so, they have, in his view, undermined national unity, and they have forsaken membership in the Argentine nation. Right? By becoming, as it were, economic foreigners, they have, they are no longer true nationals. And his isolationist policies, which he tries to enact then in largely the late 40s, expropriation of the British railways, export taxes, and domestic redistribution, are largely designed to, try and cut off this domestic elite from what he sees as the foreign sources of their wealth. Right? So here we have again a situation where aversion to internationalization, to foreign FDI, is driven by kind of domestic factors, largely by concerns about domestic inequality. I won't go into too much detail. I don't want to overrun. In the end, you see very similar dynamics in Nasser's Egypt in the late 50s and early 60s, right? Where he similarly expropriates both domestic capitalists as well as largely British and French-owned companies in Egypt, because he draws the same connection. Right? He says those domestic oligarchs, they have become foreigners by collaborating with the British or the French. And none of this is ancient history. So we see very similar dynamics, for example, in Bolivia under Evo Morales in the 2000s, where Bolivia had gone through, like many countries at the time, through spades of liberalization in the 1980s, where a formerly state-owned resource sector was privatized, then increasing shares of foreign ownership in this sector, partially under the auspices of international organizations as well. And this leads to very large popular movements that, as it says here on this sign, say, no, we should not be selling national resources abroad. We should be using them for, domestic industrialization. And again, you have the same argument that Morales makes, that internal inequality has been heightened by this foreign investment, by the internationalization of the Bolivian economy, right? So we need to kind of cut ourselves off and help the domestic campesinos rather than, as he said, the World Bank, the IMF, and the transnational corporations. Right? So some lessons that we can draw from this is that those kind of isolationist reactions occur in particular when domestic inequality is linked to the internationalization of the economy. And those reactions are particularly virulent if those domestic inequalities, as they did in the Russian case or the Ottoman case, also correspond to ethnic divisions. And then the result are often kind of populist movements that are very anti-elitists, and they work towards isolationist policies, often coupled with an element of domestic redistribution. But of course, this element of isolationism, as the second puzzle here suggests, is not the whole story, because it's not the case that once nationalists come to power, and this holds for Perón, that holds for Morales, etc., that they just transition towards straight autarky or self-sufficiency, right? That only happens very, very rarely. Right? There's always this duality between closing down a little bit, but also opening up. Right? I think one very interesting case study and a very important one is China. Right? So China, starts out as being relatively similar to some of these cases that I've outlined. Right? So you have the forced integration of China into the world economy from the mid-19th century onwards through the treaty port system, etc. And this increasingly leads to isolationist reactions. Right? So one of the most prominent is the so-called national products movement, which is basically intellectuals, nationalist intellectuals. They go around to Chinese villages and towns and tell people that, you are Chinese, and that means you should be only consuming Chinese products, and you should boycott British, American, or Japanese products. Right? And Chinese intellectuals, for example, Sun Yat-sen, who's the first president of the Republic of China after the 1911 revolution, he's very much on board to saying that, we need some degree of isolation, be it those voluntary boycotts or be it, formal customs duties. But then at the same time, he also, just like Xi Jinping would do a century later, advocates openness to FDI. Right? He says, we need to invite foreign capital, even foreign experts and organizers. Now, why is that? Well, his argument is that, what we really want is growth. Right? And in order to have growth, you need capital. And unfortunately, China is very capital poor. Right? And as he says here, in China, there are no great capitalists in the real sense of the word. And therefore, industrialization would be very slow. Right? And that requires, this borrowing of man and capital from the foreigners. And so there's this realization here on the part of Sun Yat-sen that, yes, you want some degree of isolation, but then on the other hand, there are limits on that isolation, right? Because you have another objective. That objective is growth, and that objective requires a certain degree of internationalization. Right? And he tries to, straddle in a way the contradiction between those two poles by saying, okay, we need a strong state that comes in and basically acts as a filter between foreign investors and the domestic economy. Right? And the state is basically going to take those parts of foreign investment that are useful for growth, but is going to get rid of those parts that he believes will exploit China or will have adverse consequences. Right? And you see very similar modes of thinking in Deng Xiaoping's speeches and his works. And where, to be clear, Deng is, as many in the Chinese Communist Party at that time, is a clear nationalist, right? And his point, his main goal, as he says here, is to make the country rich and strong. And it's about basically development, not for its own sake, but largely because we want to be a great nation. And therefore, we should be a developed nation. Right? That's kind of the status that we should aspire to. And that is really the driving force behind his attempts and his relatively successful policy of opening up China. But then at the same time, Deng does have isolationist instincts as well. He never, opens up fully, and he always tries to steer, a middle course between opening up and isolation, largely, following this Sun Yat-sen philosophy of having a state that tries to manage globalization, manage foreign investors in various ways. And so one way in which the Chinese state does that during the period is the creation of special economic zones. Right? So special economic zones mean that foreign investors, especially in the 1980s, they can only be active in a certain part of the country, while the enterprises operating in the interior remain protected from foreign competition, right? So it's a way of inviting in foreign investors, but not giving them access to all of the Chinese market. Joint ventures work in a very similar way and are quite explicitly designed to encourage foreign companies to partner with a domestic firm, which at that point is still largely a state-owned enterprise, which means that the Chinese economy gets access to technology, they get access to foreign capital, but control over the joint venture, control over sales and marketing and prices to some degree remains with the domestic partner, and therefore ultimately also with the Chinese government. So none of this is peculiar to Chinese economic thinking, and you see very similar philosophies in the thinking of many post-colonial African policymakers. For example, Kwame Nkrumah, he kind of goes along very similar lines, trying to kind of thread a path between, on the one hand, inviting in foreign investors, and then at the same time trying to control them, with of course the difference being that this line that Nkrumah needs to walk is a lot thinner and a lot more precarious than that which his Chinese colleagues can walk. And this brings me to what I think is really the core contribution of the book, right? And that's what the nationalist dilemma that's in the title of the work. And that is that nationalists often pursue two aims, isolation and growth development, which to nationalists is largely synonymous with industrialization. And those aims are potentially in conflict, right? And based on the examples that I've given, we can also say a little bit about some of the causes behind those divergent aims. As I've said, isolation often stems from a concern about national unity and concern about the domestic distribution of income. Whereas, this kind of Deng Xiaoping, Sun Yat-sen industrialization drive is often associated with the concern about international inequality, right? Saying that, okay, the British, the Americans, the Germans, they are there, and that's where we want to be as well, right? But typically, no nationalist will completely privilege one of those two aims. They'll often try to combine them in various ways. Right? And I've talked to some of those mechanisms in which nationalists often do that with reference to FDI, but there are others as well. Now, a third way in which nationalists have tried to circumvent this dilemma between isolation and a focus on industrialization is advocating regional integration, and that kind of solves, our dilemma number 3. And this goes back very much to the writings of Friedrich List, possibly the most widely read nationalist economist, right? The author of The National System of Political Economy. And his objective was quite squarely growth, which for him equals industrialization. And his idea was that you need a moderate amount of isolation, basically, in order for industries to develop. So it's something like an infant industry argument. But List recognized this nationalist dilemma as well, in the sense that he knew that protection had undesirable side effects. Protection could lead to inefficiencies, to monopolies, especially if your domestic market size is small. Right? And this is what he says here, that a nation without extensive territory or otherwise limited resources, etc., cannot resort to the protective system, or at least can't do this very well. You must first be enlarged by way of conquest or negotiation. Right? And his favorite solution, maybe surprisingly for a German nationalist, was negotiation. So he talks a lot about economic unions, in particular between Germany and France, as a way of pooling resources and markets together. And then the combined union would have the size that it need to erect trade barriers on the outside. But there's also this second possibility that he leaves open, saying if that doesn't work, then conquest is the other solution, right, in which you can expand markets or gain access to resources. And that is, of course, the option that interwar fascists opt for. And one of the things that really struck me when I was researching for this book is how explicitly both Nazi economic thinkers, in particular Hitler himself, but also Japanese militarists, motivate imperial expansion by making reference to this goal of autarky, right? And quite explicitly saying that we want isolation from the world economy, but in order to have isolation in a way that does not cripple in our industrialization prospects, we need a larger territory. And this is then something that, of course, then comes to fateful fruition in the 1930s. And others in the interwar period, they try and look for more benign forms of regional integration. So, for example, the British imperial tariff policy, to a large degree foot on this idea that free trade is not an option. So you need isolation. You also need maybe some degree of an industrial policy, but it's mainly really about tariffs. But Britain is really too small to do this, right? It's not a viable economic unit, and therefore the proposal is, okay, let's build a unitary economy made up of Britain and the Dominions, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, to a lesser degree, Ireland and South Africa as well. And then, we can have those high tariff barriers on the outside while we have free trade on the inside. And as such, we kind of get the best of both worlds, right? We have kind of functioning markets and some degree of integration while also being protected, right? So, rather than buying Danish bacon here, we buy our Irish bacon. Right? So one outcome of this nationalist dilemma is bloc formation, right? Both of the military kind as well as a voluntary regional integration as well. So here again, there is a sense in which nationalists will not go for pure national isolation, right? Well, what they will seek some possibly messy middle ground between international integration and isolation. Right. So let me just very briefly, because I think I'm running out of time, go to the fourth puzzle, how it can be that nationalism often becomes a force, especially as international integration advances. Right. And there are a number of explanations here. I think one that I would just briefly like to emphasize is that nationalist narratives often turn out to be very powerful in terms of uniting different interest groups that may be affected by international integration and giving them a common language that they can use, giving them a common platform, right? And in particular, giving them a way in which they can sell their programs as not being a special interest program, but being quite explicitly something that is in the national interest. And therefore, those who oppose that program are, by definitions, traitors to the national cause. And there are loads of examples of that in the book. I think a particular prominent one is the German tariffs of the late 1870s, this marriage between rye and steel. It's very much a marriage between interest groups, but at the same time, through very clever marketing and by branding this interest group marriage as advancing a national project, they managed to reach out beyond those narrow interest groups to parts of the population that in a direct material sense are not actually being affected by international integration. Mm-hmm. And this explains, I think, why not only why losers from globalization may rebel or may oppose globalization, but why they are actually often the ones setting the agenda, right? Because they have this powerful narrative that advances their cause. And then a second factor, how globalization benefits nationalists, is that nationalists often organize globally. You see that today, right? If you talk to any European right-wing movement, they almost verbatim copy the lingo and the verbiage of Trump or the Brexiteers. And this is a very old phenomenon. As I've just collated some quotes from different economic nationalists who kind of make reference to foreign nationalist thinkers and quite explicitly say that these are the ones that we should follow, right? So Gökalp is often deemed to be one of the fathers of Turkish nationalism. He says, let's follow Friedrich List. Arthur Griffith, the founder of Ireland Sinn Féin Party, he also says, Friedrich List, that's what we should be doing. Indian nationalists in the late 19th century, they basically import the thought of a whole range of foreign thinkers, which they believe will reorient Indian economic thinking. In the interwar period, Brazilian nationalists, they import the thought of a Romanian economist, Michael Manulescu, who is one of the kind of main protectionist thinkers of the interwar period. And then maybe finally one objection that I often hear is that, well, but as technology advances, etc., then all this thing about national consumption, etc., that's just going to disappear, right? Because we don't actually, firms are becoming so interconnected, products are no longer national in any discernible sense. Let's say, well, often modern technology can be used for those kind of nationalist ends, actually. So I think one interesting case is the trend of digital Swadeshi in India, which basically revolves around designing smartphone apps that you can use to distinguish Indian-made products from foreign-made products, and can therefore help the patriotic consumer to distinguish between them. So what we then see is that, nationalism, particularly economic nationalism, is very much a product of globalization, right? It solidifies interest group coalitions, it creates those nationalist networks. When information flows more freely, so do nationalist ideas. And even new technologies can be utilized to nationalist ends. Okay. So then what should we expect today? Well, many people are concerned about high levels of domestic inequality, right? And this very much correlates with the strong showings that many populist parties and approaches have had in the past decade or so. At the same time, there are also still very high levels of international differences in income, right? Which would also lend further openings for those who want to privilege, those kind of industrial policy-led programs. Now, and as I've emphasized, none of this is going to mean that we're going to transition to some utopian world where everybody grows their own vegetables in their backyard or has their own steel furnace in their backyard. But it's going to lead to a form of kind of managed globalization, which is really what nationalists want, right? A kind of a globalization where markets are heavily politicized, fragmented, and where, as I've emphasized, nationalism is a force that intimately shapes the way that globalization works. And thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Marvin. That was great. I really enjoyed it, and indeed insightful, as you said at the beginning.